I have recently written an article for New Eastern Outlook. It is this article here. Does the fate of U.S. arms in Ukraine create pause for thought ahead of war with China? I'm going to provide the link to this article in the video description below, along with all the articles that I cited in this article. But I will read this article in its entirety. I will also add additional context when and if necessary, just in case you don't feel like reading the article yourself, and also to provide that additional context. So I will begin reading. In recent months, advanced U.S. weapon systems provided to Ukrainian forces have been cornered and destroyed on the battlefield by Russian troops. This includes the first ever confirmed footage of a U.S. M142 high mobility artillery rocket system, HIMARS, the destruction of several M1 Abrams main battle tanks, and the further loss of several more Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. Newsweek reported. It has this article right here. This is the Western media admitting this. Russia destroys 3 Abrams tanks, 3 HIMARS, and 8 Bradleys in 10 days. They say it's according to Moscow, but of course, the Russian Ministry of Defense provided videos of all of this. Last year, the U.S. Department of Defense admitted that the U.S.-made Patriot air defense batteries sustained damage in a Russian missile attack, according to CNN. That is this article right here. U.S. officials say damage to Patriot missile defense system was minimal following Russian attack near Kiev. And as I pointed out at the time, they say minimal, that they seem to be trying to play around with the definition of damaged or destroyed. The Patriot missile system exists as a battery of many different vehicles, and you could just completely destroy several of them and the battery could remain intact and operational. So we really don't know what happened. The fact that they admitted that it was at least damaged seems to say a lot already, all on its own. However, this year, in an article by Forbes, it is admitted that a Russian short-range Iskander ballistic missile destroyed at least 2 Patriot missile launchers. That is this article right here. Russian drones spotted a Ukrainian Patriot air defense crew convoying near the front line. Soon, a Russian hypersonic missile streaked down. Ukraine just lost its first Patriot launchers and probably their crews. Not their first. Not their first. But at least the first the Western media will confirm. These developments end decades of U.S. claims regarding the superiority of its weapon systems, including boasts that Russia's Soviet-era equipment won't be a match for U.S. arms, as the Business Insider claimed regarding M1 Abrams being sent to Ukraine. And I referenced this article in a recent video I did on one of the M1 Abrams being destroyed in Ukraine. Ukraine is getting older U.S. Abrams tanks, but Russia's Soviet-era tanks still won't be a match for them in battle. Apparently they are a match. Apparently a lot has changed since the last time M1 Abrams fought Soviet-era tanks. So let's talk about busting the myth of American military supremacy. The Business Insider article, like many others across the Western media, repeated the myth of the superiority of America's military technology based on flawed analysis of its performance during the 1991 Persian Gulf War and the 2003 U.S.-led invasion of Iraq. In both instances, the U.S. pitted its best troops and equipment against poorly trained Iraqi forces using Soviet-era equipment already obsolete at the time. The lopsided results of the fighting in both conflicts was cited as evidence of American superiority over Soviet and then Russian Federation military technology. It also serves as the basis of assumed military superiority over Chinese military power. Such lopsided fighting was imagined by Western analysts ahead of U.S. weapons arriving on the battlefield in Ukraine. And despite the poor performance of these systems in Ukraine, such lopsided fighting is still imagined amid any potential conflict between the U.S. and China. And that was the whole point of writing this article, was to explain why the failure of U.S. military hardware against Russian forces in Ukraine bodes very poorly for any potential conflict between the U.S. and China, and I'll explain why here as I continue. However, for analysts carefully studying the evolution of modern warfare from 1991 to present day, the disparity between Western military technology and that of non-state armed organizations, even non-state armed organizations, was closing. It was narrowing. During the 2006 Israeli invasion of southern Lebanon, Hezbollah used modern Russian anti-tank weapons to inflict heavy casualties on Israeli forces, Haaretz reported. That's in this article right here. This is from 2006. Hezbollah anti-tank fire causing most IDF casualties in Lebanon. IDF believes Hezbollah also has advanced anti-aircraft missiles from Iran, particularly lethal against helicopters. Let me continue. Hezbollah's enhanced military might allowed it to stop the advance of Israeli Merkava main battle tanks and supporting troops well before their stated objective of reaching the Litani River. If you remember that conflict back in 2006, the Israeli government said they were going to reach the Litani River. They only ended up reaching it by using helicopters to land troops there, pose with the Israeli flag, and then pack up and go back to the border. It was a failure. It was a strategic failure for Israel. The Syrian Arab Army's successful use of Soviet and Russian-made air defense systems during the ongoing conflict in Syria has forced US, European, and Israeli warplanes to launch attacks using longer-range standoff weapons. These same air defense systems have been used to intercept Western cruise missiles, reducing damage to targets across the country. We always hear about how Russia's Air Force is backwards. Look at their performance in Ukraine. They have to drop these glide bombs. They can't fly freely over Ukraine. They have not established air superiority. The US, Israel, and America's European allies cannot establish air superiority over Syria for all the same reasons. There are modern air defense systems there that are being operated that the West simply cannot destroy and they cannot evade, forcing them to use standoff weapons, just like Russia is doing in Ukraine. Russia's intervention in Syria at the invitation of Damascus in 2015 was followed by an effective use of modern Russian air power, cutting the supply lines of Western-backed militants and aiding Syrian forces on the ground in encircling and destroying them, because US-backed militants in Syria did not have the air defense systems required to take out Russian warplanes operating at high altitudes. They have the man-portable systems capable of downing Russian helicopters, but they could not reach Russian warplanes at high altitudes. And Russia took advantage of that. They patrolled over supply routes to US-backed militants inside Syria and destroyed convoy after convoy, eventually depleting the fighting capacity of these forces, allowing the Syrian Arab Army to surround and destroy them. It was becoming clear that should modern Western weapon systems face modern Russian military technology, the myth of Western military superiority would be shattered. It was also becoming clear that a similar gap was closing in terms of US military technology and its Chinese counterparts. On the battlefield in Ukraine, Russian forces using modern Russian weapons are eliminating Ukrainian brigades trained and armed by the US and other NATO members. Despite high expectations ahead of Ukraine's 2023 offensive, up to 9 NATO-trained and armed brigades were decimated in months of fighting. The New York Times would report at the end of 2023 that despite Ukraine's massive offensive campaign, Russia had gained the most territory that year. You might remember this article here. It's not displaying properly. But if you go to the right here, who's gaining ground in Ukraine? They say this year, no one, but they admit that Russia actually gained the most territory right here. They admit it. Just to give you in the preferred metric of Western analysts, they prefer to cite territorial gains and losses as a metric of success. Even by those metrics, Russia succeeded last year. While it is true that Ukraine did not have enough time to properly integrate the Western arms transferred to it from 2022 onward, the performance of both Western and Russian weapons on the battlefield has made it clear that now more than ever, the idea of Western military superiority is more a nostalgic interpretation of history far from a current reality. Beyond the performance of Western and Russian weapons on the battlefield themselves, both Western and Russian military industrial capacity has been put to the test. Western private industry-run arms manufacturing had failed to develop surge capacity needed for the protracted, large-scale fighting now taking place in Ukraine. Russia's military-industrial base inherited and then enhanced and modernized such surge capacity from the Soviet Union, and according to the New York Times, despite sanctions, is now outproducing the collective West. That's this article here that I've cited before. Russia overcomes sanctions to expand missile production, officials saying. And in that article, they talk about how, in terms of all weapons and ammunition, Russia is outproducing the entire West by 7 times. Additionally, because of the complex nature of modern Western arms, a vast network of logistics, sustainment, and maintenance is required to keep these arms operating on the battlefield. A recent press release by the U.S. Department of Defense Inspector General reveals that no such system was created for U.S. weapons transferred over to Ukraine, and that without it, the Ukrainians would not be capable of maintaining these weapon systems. That is this right here, evaluation of sustainment strategies for Patriot air defense systems transferred to Ukrainian forces, and evaluation of DoD's sustainment plan for Bradley Stryker and Abrams armored weapon systems. And if they didn't provide any network of sustainment or sustainment plan for these, what makes anyone think that they're going to for, say, HIMARS or the F-16 or any of the other systems that they're not mentioning in this press release? Such support was not provided to Ukraine because of the massive undertaking such support requires for any given fighting force. One many times larger is required to support, sustain, and maintain that force and the weapons and vehicles it uses. Taken together, all of these weaknesses revealed about Western military technology do not bode well for the United States ahead of any potential conflict directly or by proxy against China. So let's talk about the narrowing gap between US and Chinese military capabilities. Not only does China have many more weapon systems comparable to the systems Russia is employing in Ukraine now, China has actually acquired some of the best Russian military technology from Russia itself. This includes the Sukhoi Su-35 warplane and the S-400 air defense system. The U.S. Department of Defense admits the growing capabilities of Chinese military systems, particularly in terms of missile technology, both surface-to-surface missiles and air-to-air missiles launched by warplanes, comparable to or exceeding the capabilities of American missiles. This is according to Air and Space Forces magazine, right here, this article. Indo-Pacific. DoD's new China report details CCP's growing military arsenal. There is no such thing as the CCP. It is the Communist Party of China, CPC. That is what they call themselves. And the only people calling the Communist Party of China the CCP are people in the US State Department who hate China and people who have been convinced by the Western media that it's actually called the CCP. I just want to point that out. Every time I see CCP, I want to point out that's actually the CPC. This is not semantics. It's as absurd as calling the US SU, States United. It's just absurd. And it's one of these power moves that the US uses to try to rhetorically subordinate China to America. And it's something they do to many countries. They use outdated names for countries back from the colonial age. They'll use, say, for Myanmar, the country calls itself Myanmar, they'll continuously refer to it, even officially, as Burma, for the very same purpose. But let's get back to the article. A 2023 Reuters article would likewise cite the U.S. Department of Defense admitting that China's Navy was already larger than the U.S. Navy. So that is this article here from 2023. What is most significant in the Pentagon's China military report? And they're talking about how the Chinese Navy, in terms of the number of ships, is larger than the U.S. Navy. They claim that the U.S. has greater tonnage, which means maybe they have fewer naval vessels, but they're more capable. But then when you consider China's advantage in missile technology, including anti-ship missile technology, I think it more than tips in favor of China. Even as Russia's military-industrial base is outcompeting the collective West, China's industrial base is larger still. Any difficulties the US is having outproducing Russia in terms of military equipment and ammunition will pale in comparison to China's military-industrial output. Together with the fact that any potential conflict the US seeks to provoke with China will take place in the Asia-Pacific region, thousands of kilometers away from US shores, and considering the extensive nature of the networks required to support US military technology on the battlefield, the idea of Washington fighting and winning any armed conflict against China appears particularly and increasingly absurd. Even if Washington's strategy is to subordinate China, not with the threat of fighting and winning a war against China in the Asia-Pacific region, but to hold peace and stability in the region hostage by threatening war regardless of its outcome, the US finds itself in a difficult and increasingly weak position year by year. You have to remember that it may not even be America's intention to fight and win a war against China, but just initiate hostilities to destroy the Chinese economy as an excuse to cut Chinese maritime shipping around the globe and attempts to collapse the Chinese economy. There's many US foreign policy think tanks that produce papers planning as much as that. Current US foreign policy is predicated on the premise might makes right. However, the US is clearly no longer the mightiest. As it provokes conflict around the globe directly or by proxy, it risks suffering severe consequences its previous advantage in terms of military power had protected it against decades ago. Continuing to pursue an unsustainable policy like this will end in disaster for Washington and also for the American people. However, the US could always pivot toward a policy of coexistence and cooperation built on mutual respect for other nations like Russia and China, as well as the primacy of national sovereignty of all nations. While the US would no longer be the most powerful nation on Earth, it would still assume a prominent and respected position within a multipolar world. Conversely, if it continues pursuing a foreign policy of belligerence, it still will no longer be the most powerful nation on Earth, but will arrive at that conclusion under much more difficult conditions. What is unfolding on the battlefields in Ukraine is giving the collective West insight into what it itself may undergo if it continues provoking conflict within a world where Western supremacy has diminished and the rest of the world is now capable of asserting its own best interest within their borders and regions of the world above the collective West and its ambitions worldwide. The collective West insists on its continued pursuit of global primacy at its own peril. And we can see this in Ukraine. It is a microcosm of Western foreign policy worldwide, where it sees it is failing, it is simply doubling down because it refuses to accept defeat. And it is doing that in Ukraine. It is also doing that on a global scale. And we can see how disastrous and damaging that is just within and around Ukrainian borders. And I think if you look carefully enough, you can see how this is already impacting the entire globe. Here in Southeast Asia, where I'm based, you can see the instability the US is causing in pursuit of this conflict it's trying to provoke with China, this military buildup, the political interference in the region as it tries to turn nations against China. You can see how it's impeding human progress, economic progress, technological progress, trade, tourism, absolutely everything. Social cohesion within countries in the region is being targeted and undermined as part of this process the US is still pursuing. And if you look at US influence year to year, while they are gaining in a certain way, in all other ways it is losing. It is losing its grip and its influence in the region. It is able to cultivate and wield proxies and cause considerable damage, but their economic influence, even their military power in this region relative to China's, is shrinking as each year goes by. And we always hear about how China is planning for war by 2025 or 2027. China is in no rush. They can see how this process is unfolding in their favor. Time is on their side. It is the US that wants to fight sooner rather than later, because the later it becomes, the weaker the US is if and when this conflict takes place. As I say in the article, the US can and it must pivot toward a multipolar foreign policy where it works among all other nations rather than attempting to impose itself upon all other nations. If it did that, it would be better for the American people, obviously, but it would even be better for the people in Washington and on Wall Street if only they could see past this sense of superiority, unwarranted superiority that they all seem to have, affecting their judgment. I will continue keeping an eye on this, just as I continue covering the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Ukraine, the Middle East, Asia Pacific, these are all linked together as one. The US has a single foreign policy to eliminate any peer or near peer competitor to maintain American hegemony around the globe. That is the common denominator among all three areas we see US-driven conflict unfolding. So I'll keep an eye on all three areas. And until next time, if you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for all of the links that I referenced, including the link to this article that I wrote for New Eastern Outlook. Check the video description for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel or any of my social media platforms. If you see ads, please feel free to skip past them because they're not helping me out at all. If you do want to support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee or through Patreon. To everyone who is helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or even if you have no money to spare and you're just sharing my work with others, all of that is greatly appreciated. All of that helps make this work possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.